welcome to everybody this morning, or whatever it is in terms of time, wherever you are at this part of the world. Welcome to the fifth and final workshop in terms of our series on entrepreneurial ecosystems. It's been a great series, very well participated and very well organized by Dan and Fumi. So great thanks to them. We've got an extended session this morning. So we're going to be over 3 hours, and we got 6 excellent presenters. And then I think at the end, Dan and Fumi are going to make some comments, maybe about in terms of moving forward, how we can take forward this group, in particular the LinkedIn group that's been devised and seems to be embraced quite enthusiastically. But I say we got 3 sessions with 6 speakers from all around the world. Which is great. And the first 2 speakers, we got Martin Bliemel from Australia, and also Martin Obchonka from Australia as well. So I think with any delays, we can kick off with Martin's presentation. So Martin.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this forum. I think it's really great that we have, such an internationally well-connected community studying entrepreneurial ecosystems. We've got an interesting, I suppose from our perspective, interesting challenge here that a lot of us probably have not done their PhDs in entrepreneurial ecosystems. Well, the origins go back, a few decades. I'd probably argue most of you are, like me, a bit of an interloper into this thing. It's a bit of a new phenomenon. So this particular talk, or this approach, this chapter, is to try and, I guess, get some not necessarily consensus, but get some agreement on how to agree to disagree on different approaches to entrepreneurial ecosystems. So you'll notice there are quite okay, here we go. So there are quite a few people on this presentation or paper chapter. So there's myself, there's Alan, who I just saw enter the room, Lisa Daniel, Saskia de Klerk, Margarita and Morgan, all based around Australia, except Morgan now that he's retired. And where a lot of this started off from is a series of workshops, largely coordinated by Alan. I think Colin participated in a few of them. So they were hosted at University of Adelaide, then University of South Australia, and often around the ESRC conference series. So for those of you who are not yet familiar with the series is the Australian Centre for Entrepreneurship Research Exchange. It's an amazing conference series where you really get a really high quality discourse around interesting topics around entrepreneurship research, entrepreneurship pedagogy, kind of the whole gamut. We've gotten lots of local interest from local councils, local state, even local industry. And some of you might remember ISRN out of Toronto. So you tell by the accent, I'm Canadian descent, Canadian accent. So I was part of that network, part of the Vancouver contingent of that network. So that really inspired part of this desire to say, well, why don't we study entrepreneurial ecosystems at scale? Is there a repeatable approach that we can survey every ecosystem, every scale of ecosystem across Australia, and then start to compare notes, rather than everyone studying their own thing and then comparing notes using different methods, different theories, et cetera? Is there a way that we can at least add some common language or common approach to all of this here? So that was one of them. So over these various conversations, we had a couple of reactions to say, hey, like we all speak the same language. We're all deeply interested in ecosystems around entrepreneurship, not just the entrepreneurship in its own sake, but also what enables it and how to, the whole gamut of how ecosystems are generated by entrepreneurship and vice versa. But there's still this underlying tension of, while we speak the same language, why is it still hard to make progress on a common method and common approach to study multiple ecosystems? Where we converged on is still just on the conceptual level. So in one of the more recent workshops that Alan hosted, we devised, okay, maybe it's this multi-level thing, very process-oriented, where at least we can agree sort of in the top left that there's more or less agreement on what the ingredients are in an ecosystem, that somehow there are some processes that bring these ingredients together, and there's some microdynamics and microprocesses. These then aggregate upwards to more of a meso level, that there's some interactions amongst groups or segments or fragments and modules within the ecosystem. And if you stitch it all together, maybe you can get to like a macro ecosystem or even a system of systems, possibly to the point that you could start doing some computational simulations on this and feed that back in to see whether the micro and the macro connect in some way. So that's all fine that we've got this, I guess, common framework that we believe is all encompassing, but it's still very difficult to make progress with such a large group. So overall, what did we agree on? We agreed on largely, turns out, mainly the parts, like the ingredients of an ecosystem, what goes into it, the entrepreneurs, all the actors, the service providers, the capital, the infrastructure, all that. We agree in general terms that ecosystems have these general attributes, that they're often networked or nested, that they're open to the environment around them, which makes it hard to draw a boundary around them, that there are nonlinear effects in them, that they're weird. I guess at the micro level, you can define causal linkages, but then the causal linkages get really tricky to identify in aggregate, which then leads to all the path dependence and tipping points and all that, and nonlinear effects. There's certainly a role to be played for agency in here too. So we kind of agreed that all this stuff matters, that the ingredients matter and all these attributes matter, but how do we approach this? So what we couldn't really agree on, like what is the whole? And the more we discuss this, the more we realize actually a lot of this probably comes back to epistemological differences. What's the only background or training that we've come from? In my case, prior days, it was probably as an engineer doing computational fluid dynamics simulations. So I was used to discretizing time and space into little tiny blocks and seeing how they interact. So that's the engineer in me that I dig in, pull it apart and see how the pieces interact. Others take a much different approach. So Morgan, for example, was much more on the aggregate policy side, looking at regional economic development. And other team members have come at from different perspectives too. And I mean, we see this riddled across the literature too, that actually, wait a second, we're not the first to have this problem. Several of us seem to have this problem, that we're united by the central idea that, okay, we think the ecosystems exist, we think we can agree on what's in them and that there are interactions between them. We think we can agree on the overall characteristics, but there's still major challenges in terms of the epistemological views and the methodology and the divergent goals. I'll come back to this article on press a few times. It's a fun one to sometimes put up as a straw man and sometimes fully agree with. In this case, fully agree with it. And if you look at every single literature review on this, you'll see that, yes, there is a plethora of intellectual backgrounds that it's informing this, or whether it's clusters, high growth entrepreneurship, industrial districts, Marshallian stuff. It's a lot of the literature reviews, when you read them or reread them, I challenge you to really have a close look to see whether jargon is swimming from one epistemology or one belief system to another one, and whether they're all being mixed together and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And that choice on whether or not to mix them is something that I'd really like to get to partway through this slide deck too. So what you'll see is just really mixing of different frameworks. So one question, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the talks today too, is to see how far can we stretch any given metaphor? Like what are the limitations of each metaphor? Should we embrace the limitations or should we push through them? So Andreas Kuchertz's thought-provoking article on taking the metaphor seriously, I think is an interesting Gedankenspiel or play with thoughts to really see just how far we can push a single metaphor versus adapting it. Eisenberg's a little more critical about using it, but perhaps not abusing it, and how others have done it. Part of this line of inquiry of how we can actually embrace the plethora of different perspectives is inspired by another local colleague, Eric Lundmark, and his colleagues, who looked at images of entrepreneurship to say, are we looking at entrepreneurship through treating the entrepreneur or the startup as the human being or as a project or other lenses, and those belief systems on what you can do to a company, or in this case, what you can do to an ecosystem and how you can cultivate it or grow it, actually inform what methods you might want to use, what data you can collect, but also what you can expect to achieve. What are the implications of your analysis? So in a sense, we have a bit of a philosophical decision to make. So this article that I like to pick on a bit, they were proposing to develop a consensus definition for entrepreneurial ecosystems. So is that actually a good thing? Do we need a consensus definition? Like, it'd be great if we could finally settle a debate and say, this is what we mean with entrepreneurial ecosystems. And it's all encompassing. But maybe that's not what we need. Maybe we actually do need definitions that are more fit for purpose, more bespoke to what it is we're trying to achieve based on a definition. So presumably you've read a few studies where or written them, where you just say, for the purposes of this study, we define X as in the following way. And so that's where I'm going with this here is, while personally I would love to finally get agreement on what a definition of an entrepreneurial ecosystem is, I do recognize there are situations where you actually want a more bespoke or more customized, fit for purpose definition of what entrepreneurial ecosystems are. That then has implications for what data and methods you use, and also what the audience is and what their intentions are. So in this case, a few of us have gotten into evaluating and mapping entrepreneurial ecosystems. There's huge, seems to be a demand for policymakers, for people in the sector to really understand what's happening even in their own backyard. So one of the examples I'll draw on is a study that we recently completed for one council that was spun off a study where we looked at an entire region around Sydney with 6 different councils, each of them seeking to find their own space, each of them trying to understand what's happening in their own backyard. Where's this economic activity come from? And how do you nurture and cultivate more productive entrepreneurship? So from the perspective of, I guess, the client or the customer, beyond just the academic contributions, if we look at the policymakers in the Economic Development Office, what they're interested in is often the outsider's view of this objective assessment of what's happening in their backyard. Ideally also with our insights of how we can nudge their ecosystem in the right direction. They also often like to use these visualizations and assessments to onboard new staff. So councils have rotations of the employees. So if the new person comes in, they can say, look, here's the landscape around you, get to know it on paper, and then immerse yourself in person. And the third point, capturing the whole and the gaps, is kind of comes back to the first one too, is they also want to sense not just what it is, but is it complete? Is it missing something? Where are the gaps? What can they do? Which then gets to this lobbying power, where they can then appeal to the next level up of the ecosystem. So the council can appeal to the state, which can appeal to the federal powers that be, to lobby for more power, for more funding, for more flexibility, for more resources, more infrastructure. And the visual aspect of it is really, really, really strong. So part of the visualization bit, while I was part of ISR and run out of Toronto, but based in Vancouver, was the Centre for Policy Research on Science and Technology. They helped produce one of the tech maps for British Columbia. They produced a 50-year genealogical map of the British Columbian tech scene. It was a huge poster, really. And it just made everyone who was mapped into that poster realize, oh my gosh, I'm actually part of an ecosystem. It created this sense of belonging and identity, not just for the people, the policy people shepherding the ecosystem, but actually everybody in it. So it gave everybody that sense of belonging. So, and that sense of belonging, that I guess poster, is often what a lot of the council, the funders like. For us as researchers, coming back to that analogy with the ISRN, the Innovation Systems Research Network, we'd love to generate this really rich data set where we can share the data across the country using a very repeatable methodology. It could be tailored to the local context, but we'd like something that could be scaled, not just locally, but across all of Australia, hopefully even internationally, to say, okay, can we come to a common method, which then gets into a better ability to compare and contrast ecosystems. While there are many, 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 many frameworks out there, I'm going to pick on 3 of them. So the commonalities for most of these that there's path dependence, interrelated factors, all the things that I mentioned earlier. But what we'll pick on, and I'm not an expert in all 3 of them. I have to draw my co-authors for them, so I might get some other things wrong because I'm more versed in one method than another, or one lens than another. So we're picking on the biological ecosystems one, which is probably where I guess the roots, no pun intended, the roots of the entrepreneurial ecosystem analogy come from. You know, the classic example of that literature in Angla's Cookhart's article of 2019, and looking at the whole, the forests and the biomass and the species all at the same time. So you have to look at the individuals and this whole system at the same time in unity. And quite often here the angle is, what is the resilience of the ecosystem? What is its sustainability? What is its ability to regenerate? So surely some of you noticed the bushfires that happened in Australia. So that led to a rethinking of, you know, okay, can the bushfire regeneration process be applied to the regional economy around here too, which also took a major hit from the bushfires. That thing gets, then the other approach that I'm comparing here is the complex systems approach here, which gets a bit swimmy as to whether it's a network approach or a complex systems approach. Rowney and Co.'s article in 2018, I found is a really good articulation of this one, where the metaphor focuses on, like, how does the system work to produce something, to produce new jobs, new products, new companies, new innovations. And because it's in its name, explicitly a complex system, it's really playing into that power law distribution, where pretty much any ecosystem has these organizations or events that are sometimes treated as outliers, which maybe we should take a closer look at, but can also be broken down into modules, which in themselves still have power law distribution. So you get some of those fractal relationships. And here the question for this type of analysis, complex systems analysis, is often geared towards, once I understand the parts and how they're wired together into this complex system, how do I rewire it? How do I find those connections to really try and maximize the production of this system? And lastly, one that Morgan helped us out with, that he's more versed in than I am, that we got a recent article about, was taking the community capitals lens. So this is one that's all, I should swap some of these columns around, that's a bit more mid-range. So it's somewhat aggregate, more like the biological system, but also it can get quite analytical down to its components, like the complex systems one. And this looks at almost agnostic of the scale of the ecosystem, looking at, you know, 4 or 5 fundamental building blocks, and what is the right combination of these blocks, rather than every single component of it, like the complex systems bit. It looks more at aggregate components of it, to look at how these resources are exemplified within a given ecosystem, which ones are the weakest link, and how one scaffolds off the other one, and whether they interact in an upward way or in a downward way. They're kind of like caricatures, and I guess stereotyping people or approaches to these types of research projects. So complex systems, maybe that's like my engineering background, where like I like to dig in, pull out the wires, see how things work, and put it back together and see if I can improve it. That's the complex systems bit. The ecological analogy, I could be biased here, I could be getting things a little bit wrong here, but it's often because you're observing something, you're not quite sure how it works, but you want to take it in its entirety, in its whole. It's a bit more of a cautious approach, a bit more like environmental risk assessments, where you're not quite sure which species are the most critical ones just yet. So take only pictures, leave only footprints. Don't quite intervene until you understand the whole system, rather than diving in, unpacking things, pulling things apart and seeing how it works. And community capital's bit is a little bit like I mentioned, finding the weakest link within the chain to really get this upward spiraling of one factor affecting the other one in a more positive way. I'm a bit of a visual person too, so I've added, you know, a couple attempts to visualize these types of systems, just to kind of bring out the outputs of them. And you can see why policymakers would want one versus another one. The diagrams on the far right don't really appeal to them. They're a little bit more academic. The middle ones are very, very technical, take too long to read, and quite often they lean towards the ones on the right. here you have to take into account, I guess, the policy natures, the agendas of the individuals, and the agendas of the governance, and what is it they're interested in, which then has implications upon the methods. While I'd love to dig into these a bit more, I am also conscious of time, but I just wanted to prompt people to think about which methods they're using, but then also tease apart what is it that that method can inform for research, but also in terms of policy, because quite often it's the policy people who then are ultimately often funding our research too. If you look at the UK's REF framework evaluation, parliamentary inquiry and policy funding is by and large the place where a lot of the research has its greatest impact. That's pretty much as far as we've gotten so far. A lot of the case studies that we've done are kind of fresh off the press. So our colleagues at University of Sunshine Coast, Rita and Saskia and Lisa have just finished up a major project. I've just 2 weeks ago finished up one of the local projects for the local council here. Alan, as we'll hear, is also hot off the heels of wrapping up another project. So we'll develop these examples in the illustrative guides in greater detail shortly. So I hope this is a good way to open up the forum and provoke a few thoughts to get you consciously aware of what approach you're taking, whether it should be a hybrid approach or a unified approach. But back to you.
Thank you very much, Martin. That's a really interesting presentation. Raised a lot of issues in terms of epistemology and, well, ontology, I think, as well, really, and how we sort of dive into thinking about entrepreneurial ecosystems. As you say, I think it is a good start to this session. Any questions? Can I take any questions at the outset, or some comments?
If no one's going to say anything, I will. Great job, Martin. Thank you.
Martin, do you focus mostly on cities or on all types of regions?
Where we're heading with this is trying to come up with that common method where we could apply it to multiple contexts. So the idea was I could study Newcastle just as well. We could study Wollongong as similar peri-urban environments. We could study very rural environments across Australia. So every year I teach a subject with about 70 students on entrepreneurial ecosystems. And this last time we studied 5 different councils and had 2 different teams looking at the network of the councils as well too, using pretty much the exact same approach. So our method of going in and surveying or interviewing individuals, what their view of the ecosystem are, and then we kind of stitch it together to a bigger system. It was a bit reassuring to see the Aspen ANDE guide by the German Institute for Zusammenarbeit for Collaboration had a very, very, very similar approach. So that's the idea, that we can come up with an approach that could be applicable to many contexts. And that's what we saw in ISRN too, that it was a common method that worked for cities as tiny as 20,000 people all the way up to the mega metropolises like Toronto.
I've been thinking about some of these issues myself as I look into this, and I've decided to take a sort of CAS approach and the roundy approach in terms of thinking it in terms of a complex adaptive system. Really, if nothing else, trying to understand the non-linearity in terms of the relationships between actors and in terms of the way that we try to study different outcomes. From the outset, it seemed a fairly inefficient process. It would seem to be in terms of entrepreneurship and in terms of economic development. To me, I think that the CAS approach offers ways of probing and thinking about that it's not actually inefficient, but it requires, as Martin says, thinking about density in terms of systems, etc. It can build up some, I think, interesting solutions, not just for leading regions, but I think in terms of thinking in the lagging regions of what they need to put in place to actually, to furnish in entrepreneurship and down the line economic development. I think you're right. I think some of the biological approaches, they've CAS sort of stem from some of that thinking in a way. I'm not so aware on the community capitals approach, but it does seem to be sort of a number of interrelationships across the 3 to me.
On that note, you mentioned leading and lagging innovation systems. Who is it to evaluate whether a system is leading or lagging? The one thing I like to push back in when I give talks on ecosystems is that even deserts are ecosystems. They're just simply lower biomass. They're very slow moving. They're not necessarily lagging. They're just a different ecosystem to a rainforest environment.
It's true. The way I've tried to do it in my work at the moment now is try to sort of link it with sort of path dependency, what's coming out from evolutionary economic geography, and to think about how whether regions or cities are actually progressing towards new path creation, etc., in a way, or maybe managing to extend other existing paths as a sort of dependent variable in a way, and what type of ecosystem to have in place to actually, again, sort of engineer or whatever, sort of configure these processes of new path creation.
Oh yeah, no, I was definitely part of the Merrick and David fan club of taking their money as long as I can. So really interesting stuff. I just wanted to come in on what Robert just said, because I think it's a really important thing, and what you just said about sort of ecosystems. Because again, this is something I really struggled with throughout my PhD, and I really sort of changed this every single day in my thinking. But the big thing for me is that natural ecosystems are normative. They are what they are. There's no better ecosystem. A desert is just as valid an ecosystem as a dense tropical rainforest. But when we, as researchers and policymakers, talk about entrepreneurial ecosystems, we're normative. We say we want to create prosperity, we want to create wealth, we want to create all these nice things. And so I think that's really where we differ from the natural sort of Humboldtian study of ecosystems, is that we have a goal. And so we can say, this place sucks and this place is good. And we want to make the bad places good, and we want to make the good places better, and we want to sort of see the bad things that occur from good ecosystems. And so I think that's a really important distinction that we need to focus on, is that we do have an end goal we want to achieve, and so we can measure against that and see where things fall down. But really interesting stuff, and again, really, we do need to think about this epistemologically, and that actually matters. It's not just conceptual quibbles.
The comparison I often push back to say it's you're comparing benchmarking against yourself. It's kind of like if you're a marathoner, you're going for your personal best. So you want who doesn't want their own ecosystem to improve? But I mean, echoing my inner Eisenberg, I'd say stop comparing yourself against Silicon Valley.
I mean, and definitely, again, that's where a lot of the stuff fails. That no one can be Silicon Valley, because Silicon Valley is rooted in American defense politics in 1930. And so it really is, again, that contextual element of what makes this stuff so rich is that every place, again, it's a race, but you're competing against yourself. It's how can you as a person do better? So when I ran this morning, I was impossibly slow, but a bit less slow than I was a month ago. And that's the improvement you're looking for, rather than beating a champion.
There is a comment from Christopher in the box.
Okay.
Every ecosystem I've experienced is an amalgam of all three frameworks. It's not my experience too. I'd probably say yes, but not by design. Probably by accident, that I've been largely ignorant of the nuances and differences between these approaches until we've had more nuanced conversations within our team, that we've finally realized there's a reason that we haven't developed a common method. And that's because we come at this from such different epistemological or ontological approaches.
Okay. We have a comment as well from Michaela saying about the role of agency, which I think is probably a nice way to segue into the next Martin's presentation. So thank you for Martin.